all of these incredible innovators. We've got one coming on today who's created this incredible scheme in Bangladesh, and she's saying, look, the important thing is that we get the money to develop these things. So it's all very well waffling on about 90% by 2020 and etc. But we need the cash. We can make the change that needs to happen. Do you get a sense that strangely there is a lot of people in their 60s telling the rest of the world what to do as they've always done, and not realising that perhaps their time is over?
Well, an interesting exception to this, again, to refer back to my breakfast, was the guy from the Rio de Janeiro city government who was in charge of their environmental policy. He looked early 30s max, and I was trying to get him to complain about Jair Bolsonaro and all what he's doing in terms of, he's got 2 bills in their Congress at the moment looking to roll back on deforestation rules and things that will stop them sort of grabbing indigenous lands and the rest. He seemed broadly nonplussed because he said, well, in our city we're controlling what's going on. All of us cities around Brazil are committed to these targets, and we're just pressing on. They alluded to what happened in the US with Donald Trump. Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but cities like, again, also at this breakfast, the mayor of Phoenix, she was saying, well, as mayors just got together and we just cracked on with all of these things, because actually, if you're talking about getting people on public transport, building houses in a different way, it's the towns and cities who are doing this, not necessarily what's happening on the federal government level.
Which brings us full circle, because that's exactly what Andy Burnham was saying on Monday. He was saying that he thinks cities are the ones who are going to be able to lead the change. Just finally, I'm going to be talking to Allegra Stratton later in the programme, the Prime Minister's spokesperson for climate, as you know perfectly well. Is there anything that you're particularly curious to hear from her?
2 things.
Oh, yeah.
On the financial point, all the announcements that we've heard today, she used to work with Rishi Sunak in the Treasury, of course. I want to know why, or maybe can they not do this, why haven't they forced governments in companies in this announcement to come up with net zero targets? Why can they not hold their feet to the fire in it? Why is it just, you just need to report your plans to us? And secondly, on a more glib point, why is Leonardo DiCaprio here? I was standing outside this leaders' meeting yesterday, and Joe Biden was walking past, Justin Trudeau was walking past, Ursula von der Leyen, Liz Truss were breezing in, and then there's Leonardo DiCaprio. And you've got delegations from poorer countries on a serious point who are complaining about not being able to get here, not even allowed, once they're here, to get into some of the negotiating rooms, and the digital platform which allows them to dial in keeps falling over. And yet Leonardo DiCaprio is in the room. He's not Jeff Bezos. He's not trumping up sort of billions and billions to help with this. He's just there, for a bit of showbiz glamour? Is that what we need?
Definitely not, and I think that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the old world finding it hard to move over and make room for the new world. I don't know if you passed that car park by the COP26 conference centre. It's just absolutely full of luxury cars.
The Lidl?
Yeah, with their engines running. I mean, what kind of message is that sending out? But there you go, the world is full of contradictions, and we're but here to report them, Luke. Is that not right?
Quite.
That was Luke Jones, reporter and presenter for Times Radio, joining me there. And we've been asking for your climate change slogan suggestions, and Dale has been in touch. Oh, this is good. Dale has been in touch via email to suggest stop gassing. Thank you, Dale. And Peter has come to my rescue on the montage and said, hi, Mariella, I think you'll find that mystery voice was Tom Lehrer, a wonderful satirist who would probably be cancelled these days, what with the masochism tango and poisoning pigeons in the park. Thank you very much, Peter. I just so rely on our listeners for illumination on all things. Meanwhile, on the money front, I know Luke and I were just talking about cash and where is it. This afternoon, MPs are voting on plans to overturn the suspension of the Conservative MP Owen Paterson. The Standards Committee voted to suspend him for 30 days for breaking the rules on lobbying, but his supporters have introduced an amendment that would pause the case and create a new committee to rule on the same case, as I understand it. At Prime Minister's Questions today, Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner asked if Boris Johnson was really trying to overturn the decision of an independent committee.
The independent standards process found that a member broke the rules on paid lobbying. Surely the Prime Minister accepts that this is and should be a serious offence. Yet we have seen reports that he will respond by scrapping the independent process and overturning its verdict. In no other profession in our country could someone be found guilty by an independent process and just have their mates vote them back into the job. Surely the Prime Minister and his government are not going to do that today.
No, Mr. Speaker, of course we're not going to do that, because paid lobbying, Mr. Speaker, paid advocacy in this House is wrong. And let me make absolutely no bones about that. And members who are found guilty of that should apologise and pay the necessary penalties, Mr. Speaker. But that is not the issue in this case, or this vote that is before us today. It is not. The issue in this case, which involved a serious family tragedy, Mr. Speaker, is whether a member of this House had a fair opportunity to make representations in this case, or whether as a matter of natural justice, our procedures in this House allow for proper appeal, Mr. Speaker. And that I think is something that should be of interest to members across this House, Mr. Speaker, and should be approached properly in a spirit of moderation and compassion, Mr. Speaker.
Well, that was the Prime Minister speaking there. Charlotte Ivers is our political correspondent, and she joins us from Westminster. Charlotte, Sir Bernard Jenkin, who's on the Standards Committee, said this morning that this looks terrible. What's the feeling among Conservative MPs?
I've spoken to quite a few Conservative MPs this morning, and there is a general air of despondency. There are probably two camps they fall into. There's one camp which recognises that what Owen Paterson did was wrong, but thinks that the system isn't fair and thinks that possibly the punishment was too harsh and therefore is happy to vote with the government today. And then there is the side that is deeply unhappy about how they're being forced to vote. Don't get me wrong, they are going to vote with the government, but they are a little bit, shall we say, a little bit depressed today about the way the whole system works and how they've ended up in this place.
Yeah, I mean, we understand that Conservative MPs are being whipped to vote with the government on this. Is that, the right way to be using the whip? I mean, funnily enough, Andy Burnham, who I talked to on Monday, I've mentioned him about 3 times today. I'm starting to sound like I'm obsessed, but I'm not really. But he talked about taking away the whip being the best way to reform politics in this country. And here we see a situation that is very, very indicative of the sort of thing that makes voters say they're all hypocrites.
Well, in theory, the government shouldn't really be getting involved in this. As the Prime Minister's spokesman has said before, matters of the House of Commons are matters for the House of Commons. And we were initially expecting this to be a free vote where MPs just vote with their conscience. Now, that started to change last night. You started to hear from MPs who are getting government whips phoning them and saying, if in theory this amendment was put down, which would change the system and lead to a review in the system, would you support it? And then, sure enough, as night follows day, this morning we learned that Conservative MPs would be whipped to vote for this amendment. So it is a bit unusual, to say the least, I would say, to see the government intervening in a matter like this.
Is this normal parliamentary business that voters don't really care about and just see as something outside of their lives and their experience? Or do you think voters really do care about this kind of thing?
That is a tricky question, and I'm not sure we'll know until the next couple of days. I'm not sure MPs will know, crucially, until the next couple of days. One of them did say that they were expecting an onslaught of angry emails about this tomorrow to me earlier. But I think this could go one of two ways, because it is a case of politicians changing the rules to suit themselves, possibly a case of one rule for them, one rule for everyone else. That's certainly one way of seeing it. And we know that is the type of thing that goes down incredibly badly with voters. Look at the fallout from Dominic Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle, for example. Then, on the other hand, it is parliamentary procedure. It's a Westminster Village story. It's something which involves an MP most people will vaguely remember from when he used to be in government, but he's not exactly a big name anymore. So it could disappear under the radar. And I think the bet the government is making is that it will.
Charlotte Ivers, our political correspondent and voice of reason. Thank you very much. John Pienaar will have the result of that vote after 4 o'clock today. And I asked Charlotte if she thought it was the sort of thing that voters care about. And we're getting reaction already. MM has tweeted in to say, one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. This is why people don't have trust in politics. The young people are turning away from voting, and the government should let the Standards Committee do their job. Thank you for getting in touch, MM. This is Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio in association with Charlie Biggums.
Carol Walker on Times Radio. I'll bring you a fresh take on the day's big stories and give you a head start on what's happening tomorrow. Join Carol Walker alongside a world-class lineup of guests, experts and contributors.
When is the pandemic end date? When are you going to be able to say once and for all, right, we've got through this, we're not going to have to worry about doing any more restrictions or any more interventions?
Unrivaled opinion, debate and insight.
Chief executives apparently have a lower dementia risk than farmers.
Carol Walker, tonight from 10 on Times Radio.
Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio with Charlie Biggums. Prepared in Charlie's kitchen, cooked in yours. Find Charlie Biggums in your local supermarket.
If we're going to reduce global emissions, we require the cooperation of all sectors. That's clear. In the presidential blue zone at COP26, finance is the focus. A study published by environmental campaign groups Greenpeace and WWF shows that London's financial sector provided loans and investments for projects and companies that emitted 805 million tonnes of CO2 in 2019. That's 1.8 times the UK's own annual net emissions for the same year when you take out aviation and shipping, which isn't included in their calculations. So, what responsibility does the financial sector have in combating the climate crisis? It's one big question that we're posing today to Alison Rose, Chief Executive of NatWest and one of the leading voices in the sector, and Thomas Taylor, Senior Manager in the Aviva Investors Sustainable Finance Centre for Excellence. Alison, one of the things that's really struck me since I got here is the absence of branding, corporate branding. Is that indicative of the fact that actually big business is on the back foot when it comes to how we're moving forward?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think business and particularly finance is really at the table here. And actually one of the great things about this COP26 is you've got the private sector really firmly involved, and particularly the finance sector with organisations like GFANS and the SMI really putting the money on the table. So actually I think there is much more proactive engagement here. You know, my view is this is a real team sport here, that we all need to work really closely together and collaboratively and in partnership to solve some of these problems.
Do you agree, Tom?
I do. I think Alison said it very well. This is a team sport. This is everyone in together. So we heard at the beginning of the conference from David Attenborough, you know, imagine what we could all do if we all worked together to fix this crisis. And what we're seeing, I think, and I hope, is that as well as all the governments, the parties here in Glasgow, who have a huge responsibility to set the trajectories, we're also seeing the private sector, finance in particular, stepping up. We know we need trillions and trillions of dollars to finance the transition. If you put it into time, 1 million seconds is 12 days, 1 billion seconds is 32 years, and 1 trillion seconds is 31,500 years. And that's, if you put that into dollars, that's the scale of magnitude of the money that we need. And governments don't have it, and so it has to come from the private sector, and so they're looking to us to invest.
Climate change is a not-for-profit business. How do you make companies wake up and encourage people to invest in projects that perhaps don't have an overnight return? Alison?
I mean, I think there was a huge opportunity here. We did a piece of research as one of the biggest lenders to small and medium-sized businesses in the UK. We identified that there is a £160 billion revenue opportunity, 130,000 jobs that could be created, and projects that are financeable that are related to sustainability and climate. So if you are a small business owner, there is real opportunity here to invest in your business and to be part of that. And the point about what do we want from the public sector, I guess the real message here is the money is here. The private sector is not saying we need money. We've got the money. We're putting it on the table. We want to be part of financing this transition and a just transition, but we need public and private sector to work together in some clear targets and direction of travel.
Markets react to signals from government as to where future policy is going to go. So an example of that is in the UK, there was the announcement of the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles. Auto manufacturers react to that. Earlier in the year, it was almost every week that one of the big auto manufacturers would announce when it was going to switch to battery electric vehicles. It was going to invest all its research and development into EVs. So that's one thing. We need those sorts of signals, but for every sector, not just transport. We need a plan for what we're going to do in this transition to get to net zero so that we can invest in it. The other thing is to make sure the valuations of companies that we can invest in or underwrite or lend to reflect the risks and the opportunities of climate change and the other sustainability issues. Things like a carbon price would be critical to that because it would change the profit of the polluting businesses and give them an incentive to be more environmentally friendly.
There are lots of companies still carrying on with business as usual. Are we seeing companies actually divest themselves of unsustainable assets and commitments?
The 10-point plan with the government sets a clear direction of travel, but we should be under no illusions. This is hard. If you're a business owner, particularly a small business owner, you're dealing with the post-pandemic, post-COVID, where you've been surviving and now trying to reopen. You've got supply chain challenges, you've got skills, labour shortages, you've got inflationary cost pressures happening. It's not easy. But we know that businesses and business leaders really do care about building long-term sustainable supply chains. We know resilience of supply chain is really important. We know consumers really care about it. These are the people who are going to be, spending money and buying. The challenge is getting into the how. Everyone can relate to the 1.5 degrees, they understand the issue, but how does that affect my decision making? You're starting to see asset managers, the people who are investing in companies really demanding clarity around what is your plan? How are you going to get to net zero and what does that mean? Some of the new technologies are not there. We've seen with the energy crisis, we're still reliant on old energy and new energy isn't there yet. So having the plan and having the roadmap and making sure that there is a credible transition is really important.
And of course, most people aren't investors as such. They just do their job, get paid their wages and try and plan for the future in whatever way they can. Perhaps with pensions. And they're one of the most powerful ways that I suppose each and every one of us can participate because, as people like Richard Curtis are now pointing out, the money that you put into your pension should be transparent. You should know where it's going and you should be making choices about what industries you're investing in. Tom, do you think that that's actually a sensible thing to do from a financial point of view now?
Yeah, I agree. If you've got a pension with your employer, the likelihood is you own just a tiny little bit of the companies that we see on the high street. You own a little bit of Apple and a tiny little bit of Microsoft and so on. And actually, with those investments, when you add them all up together with all the other people at your employer and all the other people at whichever asset manager the pension scheme chooses, that's a huge amount of money. There is $50 trillion invested in pensions around the world. And when most people are saving for their retirement, what you don't think about is a world disrupted by hurricanes, a world disrupted by floods and wildfires, and a world potentially where huge amounts of people have to move from where they live due to temperature rises. So we have problems with migration, with refugees, with world peace. So making that connection, as groups like Make My Money Matter are doing, is really important.
Do you agree, Alison?
No, I do, but I think that the challenge is giving people the visibility and the confidence in that visibility to
you mean
to see
transparency,
that.
don't you? Because I would say that the financial sector is one of the least transparent sectors out there, and perhaps that's one of the very first things that needs to change, so that people actually feel that they understand and are seeing the real picture.
Yeah, look, I think the transparency is really important, and coming up with common data, common terminology, and so that people, when they're making those individual decisions, can see where their money is going.
And just finally, we've talked nationally. What about internationally? Earlier in the week, I talked to the Environment Minister of Palau, and he was astonishingly impactful in terms of his incredibly raw, honest, sincere description of what it's like for countries who are at the absolute front line of climate change. And, what he said over and again was that it is the responsibility of wealthy nations like our own to help countries like his.
Yeah, look, I mean, climate change is happening and it's real, and speeches like that and information like that tells you it is something that's being really felt. And there is a real requirement for the developed nations to support the developing nations and access the money to do that. And because